Hello. I'm so excited to be here with you today, Heart Lifters. You might get hungry when you are listening to this beautiful episode that I'm bringing to you with Kendall Vanderslice. Kendall is a baker, a writer, a speaker, and a founder. Well, excuse me. Kendall is a baker, writer, speaker, and the founder of the Edible Theology Project, a ministry that connects the communion table to the kitchen table. Welcome, Kendall. Tell us all about this. This is so fun.
Thank you so much. It is so good to be here with you today.
I mean, where were you? I always love to ask this question. Where were you when you came up with that connection? Connecting the communion table to the kitchen table. I have never heard that said. Maybe it has been, but I just think brilliance.
Well, thank you. Well, I think the first time that I really made that particular connection was when I was a senior in college and I was trying to figure out, I knew that I wanted to work in food in some capacity. I had known really since I graduated high school that I wanted to be a baker. And
really,
it is a long sort of circuitous journey, but the short of it is that God made it very clear that I was supposed to go to Wheaton College to go to undergrad. And I really went kicking and screaming. I was like, I want to be a baker. I just want to go to culinary school and, start working in kitchens. And I felt so strongly that God was telling me, no, you need to go, to this particular school. And so I went and, going after a very practical degree, decided to study anthropology, which is the most logical thing to study if you want to become a baker.
Kendall, you do write about bread baking all over the world.
It's true. God knew early on.
Fascinating.
But so my last year at Wheaton, we got two new faculty one who worked on anthropology of food and one who worked on anthropology of consumption. And they just opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about food and realizing that, my work with food didn't just have to take place in the kitchen, that I could understand food from the perspective of history, from culture, and from theology as well. And so I was working on a final paper trying to pull together these pieces and looking at, how do I see food at play in the narrative of Scripture? And so I was looking at, the creation accounts in Genesis, and then I realized this is a story of a meal. This is a story of a meal that's gone awry. But then when we look at the story of Jesus' Last Supper, this is also a story of a meal, and of a meal that puts everything right again. And that was just a mind-blowing connection.
That is very mind-blowing.
This is this tale of two meals where God is telling us what God does at the table. And then when we look ahead to the account in Revelation, we have this image of a marriage supper of the Lamb. We have this image of the tree of life returning, that it's just these stories of meals all throughout Scripture.
Banqueting table.
Exactly.
My goodness,
and so that just blew up my whole paradigm. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how you make a job out of this, but it's more than just baking. And so that was really kind of the genesis for me.
I love those stories. My daughter, Brooke, and I, when I was in St. Louis, helping with baby June, my fifth little grandbird, we watched the Martha Stewart Netflix documentary. Have you watched it?
Yes. Oh, yes, I have. I found it fascinating.
Right?
Yes.
I want to know what you found fascinating and see if we're on the same track, because your story reminds me of that documentary in many positive ways.
Well, I just found it fascinating the way that she, I just think that she's a fascinating human being, both in positive and negative ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was interesting it's interesting for me, I think, being someone, I am a food scholar, so I have done a degree in food studies. And so, we are studying how food culture is created. And so I've been, for the last couple of years, really focused on understanding the development of 20th century food culture and how media plays into that. And so it's interesting to have these figures who we just kind of take for granted as like Martha Stewart. Yes, this was, she was just a presence in many of our homes.
Oh, for
in the
sure.
last, 30,
I'm a
40
lot older
years.
than you, but yes,
But
for sure.
yes, but then to see, like, to be reminded, oh yes, she has this origin story. She has this, way in which she built things that, like, it didn't just kind of happen. She didn't just appear. And so I found seeing the unfolding of her journey to be really fascinating.
That's it. That's exactly what I was going to say. It was so organic, and one thing led to another, which led to
Yeah.
another. So it was like the beautiful, one of my favorite unfolding of his word
Mm.
brings light. And I always use that with my children when they were, heading off to college and what am I going to do? What, all of
Yeah.
those existential questions that we find ourselves having. And I felt it was just such an incredible unfolding, especially the
Yeah.
finance part of her life. I didn't really understand that she actually was a floor trader, like she was involved in that.
Yeah.
Then it
Yeah.
made more sense as to the later debacle or whatever you
Yes.
want to call it.
Yes.
And so I just thought it spoke to my heart in the same way as your story just spoke to mine, that you just had a passion, that's safe to say.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Was that passion present from childhood? Like we're baking
It
breadcrumbs? Like was
was,
that in your?
yes, it really was. I went on a field trip in, I think, probably first or second grade. Went on a field trip to a Great Harvest Bread Company, and I remember it so vividly, being in, with my whole gaggle of classmates, all in our uniforms, and I just remember being enamored by
I
the
love it.
process. These like massive bags of flour and these massive
Yes.
mixers, and sort of the dance of shaping dough. And so I think I was mesmerized by it from a young age, but I didn't really realize, that that was what I was constantly being pulled towards. But in high school, the kitchen was kind of my place of solace. That I
Mm.
was a very anxious
Mm.
teenager, and so it was
Wow.
where I went to process kind of thoughts and emotions. And I was one of five children, so our house was never quiet.
No,
So
no. Where
after
is your
everyone had
placement?
gone,
Where are
I'm
you?
number I'm number two.
Okay.
And we have a 16-year age span from oldest to youngest. So there were,
Whew.
toddlers going crazy in the house while I was, studying for final exams in high school. And so
Mm.
um,
Wow.
after everyone went to bed, it was like the kitchen, the silence of the kitchen. That was the only time to really get quiet in the house. And so
Mm.
I did a lot of late night baking and praying and processing,
I
of what am I
love
doing with my
that.
life?
Oh gosh, Kendall, you just said something that blew my mind. And Heartlip, did you know how excited I get? And I'm really trying to harness that energy so I don't blast your ears. But when you talked about the dance of
Yeah,
making dough,
yeah, yeah.
Kendall, I have been a dancer since day one. So my passion,
Yeah.
my quiet place, my
Yes.
solace was on a stage, believe it or not, or
Yeah.
in a dance studio from, gosh, age 4. And so I love that you just combined our passions, not even knowing you were doing that. But what does that mean? What
Well,
I the dance of
so
making
I
dough?
I am a dancer as well, and that
Kendall.
plays significantly into my own story. And
Okay.
so I
Hmm.
was a dancer, and all through this time in high school, had a very fraught relationship to my body because of it. I am not built like a
Yes.
ballerina, but I was trained in classical ballet, and so
Oh
so
dear.
much of my processing in these years was, I have spent all of my life up till this point training for a professional classical ballet career, and I am now being told like there's no way your body will be capable of doing that.
I'm
And so
so sorry.
that was such a part of my processing. But then when I went to
Mm.
Wheaton, they were when I my first year there was a year that they were attempting to rebuild this dance company on campus that was specifically focused on helping women who had grown up in the dance world in a really painful way to heal their relationship to their bodies and
I
heal their
love
relationship
this.
to dancing.
I love it
And
so
that's where
much.
I was introduced to the concept of embodied prayer, this idea that we can pray with our
Yes.
entire bodies. And so um, that for me was a just incredibly healing
Mm.
thing,
So glad.
but also opened my eyes to this whole new way of thinking about my body and how I connect with God. And so it really was that dance that then helped me see how baking itself, baking too, can be a form of embodied prayer. And so for me, that dance and that baking are always so deeply intertwined.
It's just so beautiful. And it flowed out of you exactly like a beautiful choreography would. So it's
Oh,
just like,
thank
the
you.
dance of the dough. I can just see
Yes,
it in my
yes.
brain. I just love this so much. So when then you take us from, I love your story so, so much because of its organic, beautiful unfolding. And I think that will speak to so many of us here in the first of the year, a brand new year, and how I am so committed right now in my own life to once again in this s- third act of my life, to have that organic unfolding again. Does that make
Yeah,
sense? Not
yeah,
something I'm pushing or I'm
yeah,
striving, or it just opens.
yeah.
And so I wonder after college, then we all know that you went to Boston University for your MLA in gastronomy. How many was that immediate or was that?
Yeah, I had 1 year off before I started the food studies program. But both throughout in my that sort of gap year before and then throughout the program, I was working in the restaurant industry during that time as well.
Oh, beautiful. So I'm
Yeah.
sure you had many, many revelations. Do you write about that in the book just to let our heart
I
lifters
do. I
know?
write about it a
Okay.
little bit in Bake and
Okay.
Pray, but a lot of this story is actually in my book by Bread Alone. So if you really want to dig into
Perfect.
the dance piece and more of
Hmm.
my personal background, that is the two go beautifully together. Both, I mean
Okay.
that design wise, we designed them to look beautiful together.
And they do.
But the
And they do
stories
flow.
intertwine as well. Yeah.
They very much do. So I want to focus today so much on your direction then after your Boston University
Yeah,
experience. And then you went to Duke Divinity School. Okay,
I
so
did. Yes.
we see these three beautiful flowing brooks into this river, right? And
Yeah.
then into this ocean of the ministry that you now have today. But what led you to Duke?
Yeah. So I had been um, curious about sort of the theological piece of what I was doing, really from the time that I was at Wheaton. I think the way that education is approached there is thinking about how our faith is informed by our academic work. And so I
Yeah.
brought that into my work at Boston University, where I knew I was
Mm.
interested in the faith angle in some capacity, but I didn't really know how to get in. I was not trained in theology, and
Hmm.
so I wrote my thesis studying a church in the suburbs of Boston, and so that
Oh,
was what I focused on research wise while at Boston University. And I worked with faculty at the School of Theology there to help sort of design that project.
wow.
And so from there, I ended up kind of expanding my research, studying a handful of other churches. And as I was working with pastors from a wide range of theological backgrounds,
Hmm.
I realized, I don't know how to even process the range of beliefs and the range of experiences that I'm encountering. And so
Yeah.
I went to do kind of half with personal theological questions. I just wanted to help understand, like, why am I convicted in the ways that I personally am convicted? And also, what is the
Yeah.
history of the tradition I grew up in, the tradition of
Mhm.
these other pastors that I have worked with? So part of it was just that personal theological wrestling. And then part of it was really wanting to dig deeper into this theology of food.
Hmm.
Um, because I felt like, there is not that much written on it, but there it is
Mm-mm. No.
so rich. There is so much there. And so it was kind of that dual, both academic and also personal desire.
I mean, until I met you through this book and through Tyndall Momentum, thank you. I can't say that I even realized there was a theology of food, but of course there is.
Yes, yes,
And the like you said to us in the beginning, the correlation and the relevance that God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit place on the table,
yes,
coming to the table. Now we hear a lot of
absolutely.
that, but I was just so curious to find out. Can I ask you, what were you studying in all of these different, what led you to these different churches? Like,
Mhm.
what was your purpose?
Yeah, so I wrote my thesis while I was at Boston University on a church that called itself a dinner church. So they held their service around the table. So my interest at that point was on what happens when we eat together that changes the way we interact with one another. Why is the table a place where community is built? And then I was wondering, what does that have to do with communion? What is that? How does that shape our understanding of why Christ would give us a table at the center of Christian worship?
Brilliant.
And so I studied that one church and then started learning about several others that were worshiping in a similar way. And so
Okay.
went and studied all of those churches as well. And really, part of it was that I just couldn't even pinpoint my theological questions at that time. And my background was in anthropology. The sort of research methods I was trained in was ethnography. And so this was kind of the way that I
Yeah.
could start thinking about these questions I had about the connection between the communion table and food in general.
I am just speechless. Like, there's so many questions that I have. I'm so curious. It's so cool and just so very powerful. So then, okay, how then did the Edible Project come into being? So this is a very
So
short synopsis. This is not a Netflix documentary yet of how God has unfolded his purpose in your life, but I find it fascinating. So where did the Edible
yeah.
Project come from?
So the name Edible Theology started right before I went to Duke. I was trying to figure out how to encapsulate what it was that I was doing because I didn't just want to study kind of a theology of food. I was interested in how food culture and theology were intertwined. And so there
Yes.
had been some books written on food and faith or on a theology of food, and they tended to be from sort of an agrarian perspective, really digging into the Genesis account, this question of how should we grow food today? And
Right.
that was just not quite what I was curious about. And so I wanted a way to sort of encapsulate what I was doing. And a lot of my food studies colleagues were using edible kind of something as a way of encapsulating what they were doing in food studies. So, edible history or edible, edible,
Oh,
there's the edible sort of state magazine. So edible North Carolina, edible, Massachusetts, or that
I
those
see.
are that's kind of a way of thinking about how food and culture intertwine.
I
And
got
so I
it.
thought, well, edible theology sort of encompasses what I'm wanting to do, that it's about both how we learn about who God is through the process of eating and also how our relationship to food is shaped by our relationship to God. And so
Oh,
that was kind of the name was just what I like put on my blog to describe what I was trying to do at Duke. And then about a year later, I started an email newsletter. And so I titled it Edible Theology because that seemed like it encompassed what I was doing. And then, over the next few years, I started developing various other resources and realized edible theology has kind of become a thing outside of me, that this is kind of the
yes.
organization under which all of my work is taking place. And
Right.
so it has, in some ways, been a very organic unfolding. In some ways, it's been a
Hmm.
very like anxiety ridden questioning, where exactly are you leading me next, God?
Good to know.
Uh,
Really, really good to
it has
know. It's very
not been
comforting.
straightforward by any means. From internally, it has felt very fraught and very confusing, and like I've tried a
Scattered.
million things.
Okay.
People who have observed from the outside said that they do not, they did
No.
not, that they did not capture, they did not experience that anxiety. But to me, it felt like I am just throwing everything out there and seeing what sticks. Um,
Yes.
and it has been just really beautiful to see God sort of shape my thoughts and shape my work and
Right.
connections and community in the process.
Just want to get back. I can't get away from the dance of the dough, the dance of creating dough or making dough. What is it? What is it about baking? I know personally, I when my children were very small, they had food sensitivities, a few allergies, not to the point of an EpiPen, because I found help and holistic doctors to help them. But I was forced to make my own bread. A friend of mine who has beautiful Mennonite matriarchs in her area attuned me to this wheat they make in Montana. Now it's readily available. You can buy it already milled, but at that point you had to actually get the berries from Montana. It's called Montana wheat. And I had to get a mill. And if anyone knows me, I'm not really Betty Crocker at that point. I ran a dance studio. I'd been a dancer, shine and gleam and sparkle and all that. Well, I was forced to mill the wheat, make 6 loaves a week because they could actually tolerate this red berry Montana wheat. And it was a miraculous time for us. They started being able to
Mm.
have like a grilled cheese with goat's cheese, and I could make a pizza crust, and I made muffins and anything and everything, cookies from that wheat. And I know for me, that time of the week where I kneaded the dough, maybe
Mhm.
it was the dancer in me, I don't know, was holy.
Yeah.
I think it began, like you're saying, this word embodied. We talk about that a lot here in the community. It was an embodying time where I felt connected to a deeper place in myself. Is that what you're saying? Am I on the right
Yeah,
track?
yeah, absolutely. Part of it is that I think it's hard to even describe. It's something that you have to experience.
Yes.
But I think part of what makes it so significant is that there is this kind of miraculous transformation that takes place over the course of making bread, that there's nothing
Mhm.
quite like it.
Mhm.
That this wheat is fundamentally transformed, that when wheat is ground into flour and then that flour is mixed together with water, the water fundamentally transforms that wheat in a way that it cannot be reversed, which I think is this just
Wow,
beautiful
so
parallel to our
beautiful.
baptism, that that
Yes.
amino acids and enzymes are activated that unravel these protein strands that fundamentally transform the structure of this wheat. And it goes from, a million disparate particles to this deeply intertwined and interlocked
Mm.
network of proteins. And you feel that transformation in your hands as you mix and then
Oh,
knead
yeah.
dough. But then there's also this inherent slowing down that
That's
baking
it.
bread is a slow process, that it requires slow work and then it requires rest. And you get to see the transformation that takes place while this
Hmm.
dough is at rest and while you as the baker are at rest. And so I think that God is communicating to us fundamental truths about what it means to be human in the process
Hmm.
of baking bread. But it's
Hmm.
also bread has been the fundamental, it's been the kind of the core of the human diet for most humans throughout most of
Yes.
human history. And so I think there is some kind of just visceral understanding of
Mm.
our connectivity that we experience in baking bread that,
Mm.
for me, I was not at all surprised in 2020 when everyone just sort of collectively turned to sourdough bread baking because we had this loss of community, we had this loss of control, and
Mhm.
suddenly bread became this thing that connected us that I think was kind of at a fun, maybe digital level. We all sort of knew everyone else was doing it, but I think
Mhm.
at a much deeper
Mhm.
spiritual level as well, it was connecting us in the way that bread has always been meant to do.
It brought everyone to a digital table, didn't it?
It did. It did.
It really did. And I think your analogy or your visual of water being poured on the flour and that miracle
Yeah.
when all of the things, and you know the gastronomy behind that, you said that so beautifully. I didn't know that. Like amino acids and proteins and all of
Yeah.
that, and you can't reverse it.
You can't. Nope. Nope.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So you are calling me back. I have been thinking about it since my friend started making her sourdough, and she's just got me so excited to getting, my hands back in some dough.
Yeah.
And it was a healing time. Was a very anxious time in my life, like you were saying about your time in high school, and you know, life is anxious, I think, today. And so putting your hands back in some dough might be just might be the antidote that we're all looking for. I'm
I
so
think so.
curious for you to tell my heart lifters, excuse me, my heart lifters, and I'm gonna not say this right, but part one is mise en place, M-I-S-E,
Mise en place.
mise en place, mise en
Yes.
place. Okay,
Yes.
I only know what it is from reading your work, but I know maybe some of my heart lifters know. But I would love you to tell us what that is and why you put that first.
Yeah, so mise en place is the process of preparing for the dish that you're about to make. So in the professional kitchen, it means weighing out your ingredients, reading your recipe all the way through from beginning to end, so that you know where you're going to end up before you begin. And so, oftentimes we think of the beginning of baking being the actual mixing of ingredients, but in a professional
Mm.
kitchen, you can't afford to make a mistake. You can't afford to start baking and then realize that you were missing an ingredient, or start baking and then realize that your, timing isn't right. And so this mise en place is this time of preparation. And
Mm.
that time of preparation is what makes it possible to go into the rest of your day,
Mm.
knowing that you're going to be successful. And so
Yeah.
I like to think of it as a spiritual practice as well, our spiritual mise en place, this time of preparing our own
Mm.
hearts and minds for the ways that God might meet us in the kitchen and the process
Mm.
of preparing our food.
Mm. What might that look like? Like you're
Yes.
really calling me, you're calling me home.
Mm.
I just got a brand new kitchen. My husband's a kitchen designer.
Oh,
And
amazing.
before we've had a kitchen and design business for 36 plus three in the garage of our baby house, we called it. I started in the garage and he just retired. We just retired from that family business. And I said, before you retire, you have got to give me one of your kitchens because I did not have one. And I'm like, that would just be embarrassing. It's just a must.
Yes.
It is very practical and beautiful. I didn't get a second oven that I wanted, but I wanted to have a double oven, always have, but I just didn't have the space. And so I have a brand new, beautiful kitchen that I actually love being in.
Mm.
And I think you're just calling me back. And I think that you are calling back to many of us to a
Yeah.
simpler way of life. Is that part
Yeah.
of your edible theology?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think so often our relationship to work, our relationship to
Mm-hmm.
food, our relationship to the kitchen can be very fraught and very anxiety ridden, that
Mm-hmm.
we're constantly sort of searching for the right way to do things, the best
Yeah.
way to do things. And I think in that sort of anxious quest for
Mm-hmm.
how to do things well, we fail to actually just slow down and see the ways that God is present with us in these incredibly simple rhythms. And so
Yeah.
my goal with this book is to provide a blueprint of how to do that with
Good.
the process of making bread. But
Mm-hmm.
I think these tools and these practices can reverberate out into our cooking, but also our work outside of the kitchen as well. And so the way that I provide that structurally is
Mm-hmm.
through a series of liturgies. And
Good.
so
Tell us. I know.
yeah, so a liturgy is kind of the words and the rhythms of our worship.
Mm-hmm.
And so every church has a liturgy of some form. For some churches, it's a very formalized liturgy of the
Mm-hmm.
words that you repeat each week, the movements that you repeat each week.
Right.
For some churches, it's very informal, but it's still a liturgy. This practice of you go in and you sing 4 or 5 songs. You have this sort of inherent sense of when do I raise my hands and when do I
Yeah.
close my eyes? And then you hear a sermon and you have the altar call. That rhythm that you repeat as a community week after week after week actually
Mm-hmm.
shapes your understanding of who God is, of how God is working in your community, and how God is speaking to you. And
Mm-hmm.
so that liturgy, that rhythm, is how God how God speaks to us and how God forms us and shapes us. And so I teach these bread recipes in terms of a liturgy. And so these prayers and these rhythms to repeat every single
Mm-hmm.
time that you bake, because I don't think that I can fully help you understand just in your brain how this works. Instead, you have to practice it. And it's through that practice again and again and again that I encourage you to invite God into this process and invite God to shape you through the process of baking bread. And so the first half of the book is these 6 different lessons and
Yes.
six
Walk us
different
through it. Just
liturgies.
give us that. Yeah. I have them right
Yeah.
here.
Oh, perfect. So those first 6 lessons are all a way to teach you just the very basics of bread. It is the same recipe again and again and again and again, and encouraging you to pay attention to just a slightly different aspect of the bread each time. And so through this repetition of baking again and again and again, and of following these liturgies that are very similar but slightly different, they encourage you to see different things in the bread and see different ways that God is teaching you through bread, all while you yourself are learning to become comfortable with this particular bread baking recipe. And so then from there, once you have become comfortable with this basic bread recipe, I provide recipes for breads from Christian traditions all around the world throughout
I
history. carry
See,
you
there
through the
you
whole
are, you
liturgical year.
anthropologist, you.
Yes, yes,
I
yes, yes.
love
So
it.
I've got recipes for Advent, recipes for
Oh,
Christmas, recipes for Epiphany, for Lent, for Easter, and for All Saints. And so it is a really fun food history and anthropology, but also church history, a way of learning kind of
yes.
how the church has known God through bread for generations and
Yes.
generations.
And the illustrations are just so beautiful and simple and inviting. I mean, the whole book it's just a breath. It's a breath prayer. That's what the book is.
Yeah,
Do
that's the
you?
goal. That's
Well,
definitely the
you
goal.
nailed it. You
Oh,
did.
thank
It's
you.
just simply Tyndall nailed it. I love Tyndall Momentum anyway. Their books are incredible. And do you have a liturgy you could share with us right now that you could
Um,
pull up or
yes, sure. So
take your time?
one of my favorite prayers. So the liturgies, it walks you through all of the different steps of the bread baking process. And there are different prayers for different parts of the process.
Hmm.
But the my favorite prayer, let's see if I can find it. Here it is. It is from the liturgy for bread baking with attention to transformation.
Ugh.
And so this prayer is to be repeated while you are shaping the dough. But it says, God of transformation, I want to put my trust in you. I want to rest and believe that you are at work along the way. Let this bread in my hands serve as a constant reminder that you renew me day by day. Though doubts may come and hopes may crumble, your faithfulness remains the same. Amen.
Oh man. Look, Kendall.
Oh, I love it.
I have it pulled up here.
Oh, perfect, perfect,
It's page
perfect.
44 and 45. So I just love it so much. Why do you think, or do you have a theological say in why Jesus said, I'm the bread of life?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I have been trying to probe
Hmm.
that statement for
Hmm.
years now, and I feel like I excuse me. I've been trying to probe that statement for years, and I'm constantly seeing more and new ways that God reveals God's self to us through bread itself. And so
Hmm.
I think in part it is this very basic statement of those who heard Jesus say that knew that bread was fundamental to life, that it was most of what they ate. But I
That's
think that
right.
as we learn about the science of bread and as we actually
Mm.
practice baking bread, we learn even more about how God is revealing God's self to us through bread. And so
Mm.
um, there is just so much that I just want to say you have to actually bake bread to it's something that you
It's
understand more
tangible.
through the actual
Right.
practice of baking it. Yes,
Yeah, it's hard to, I
that
can,
that God is actually present with us through bread itself in this very beautiful, delicious, tangible way.
I think that it must have been very, very difficult to put this into words because it is an intangible, and then you're trying to make it tangible, how God reveals himself through a practice that involves our hands and our being. And I just think,
Excuse me, sorry.
no, I think the idea of a dinner church is radically amazing.
Yeah.
I'm taking that away with me today. Did you write about that in your first book or?
So my first book is called We Will Feast, Rethinking
Yes.
Dinner, Worship
Okay.
and the Community of God. And that book is
Okay.
a study of dinner churches.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
don't think I knew that. Didn't do my homework
yes.
on that one. So
That's
I
okay.
will definitely find that. When you talk about the science of baking, I am just really curious outside of the flour and the water meeting, what would be the next step in the science of bread making? I am so curious.
Yeah, so once the water starts to unravel the proteins in the dough, it unlocks the starches in the dough as well. And so the yeast begins to eat the starches that are present in the dough. And as the yeast eats the starches, it releases carbon dioxide. that gets trapped in this protein network. And so that
Mm,
protein network called gluten is what is able to hold on to this carbon dioxide, and that's what allows our dough to grow while also holding its structure and its shape.
mhm,
And so this process of baking bread is about building tension between these protein strands and their opposing qualities and their opposing needs, and building strength and building structure and building shape and flavor in our dough as the yeast works its way through.
So the yeast has to work its way through.
It does. Yep.
That's that beautiful story in the scripture.
Yes, 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 yes.
There's just so many, many stories about bread and yeast and all of these things. Kendall, I honestly would like you to just do a whole lecture series on this because it's moving, it's calling, it's I had a reflection and I wanted to see if I'm way off base because sometimes I can just get a little cray cray woo woo. But I know my own journey with my children's gluten intolerance and food sensitivities, and then finding that wheat that actually someone with celiac could eat, that Montana wheat. I remember the first time I made the bread, it only had 6 ingredients, and I gave it to my children, and I was so nervous because I thought they're all going to just break out in hives. I'm going to have to call,
Yeah.
you know, the ambulance, but they tolerated it so well. And I
Wow.
actually believe in my heart of hearts. I mean, the twins are now 34 and my oldest is 38, and they can eat anything. Like
Mm,
I believe it was a part of healing their DNA, their structure,
mm,
their, all the amino acids, all those things that they were deficient in.
mhm,
Perhaps maybe because I had been anorexic. I don't know. And my
mhm.
being was not as healthy because, bread's a taboo when you're a dancer. You don't eat bread.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't eat carbs, even
Yeah.
today, God
Yeah.
forbid. But I feel very strongly that it has everything to do with slowing down.
Mhm.
And when we have a healthy sense of self, like I say here, and healthy behaviors and healthy communication, when we're healthy inside, I think it increases our tolerance and increases our capacity to be able to eat like God designed for us to eat. Am I off track?
No, I don't think you are at all. I think, you know, the history of bread in the United States over the last century is a really fascinating one.
Talk to
That
us. I love
this
this.
turn to industrialized bread was a very uh, sort of distinct turn that happened just over a century ago. um,
Wow.
with the advent of commercial yeast, and just post Louis Pasteur, this understanding of bacteria and yeast. Prior to this time, we didn't know what bacteria were. We didn't know exactly what yeast were.
Right.
We could
Exactly.
witness the repercussions of them, but we couldn't
Right.
isolate that it was these microbes who were making this transformation. And
Hmm.
so, late 19th, early 20th century, scientists are able to identify that it is this yeast and bacteria. And so that sparks this movement called the sanitation movement. And there was this great anxiety around bacteria and yeast because
Hmm.
we knew that it could cause disease. And
Sure.
so there was this hyper focus on sanitation and control and eliminating bacteria and yeast. And
Yeah.
bread was seen as a very dangerous kind of thing because it involved this very physical process. Your hands had to get in the dough.
Yes.
It was
Right.
reliant on this like long transformation of bacteria and yeast. But there were also, fears of social change that were mapped onto that. It was largely immigrants who were the professional
Mm.
bakers. And there were these sort of fears of immigrants that
Mhm.
these fears of sort of bacteria and yeast were mapped onto these fears of these immigrant communities. And
Wow.
so bread was seen as dangerous and as something harmful to our bodies.
Wow.
And so this new method of making bread was developed, this industrialized method, that, these machines that can make bread from start to finish in a really short amount of time. And the
Mm.
marketing sort of ploy behind it was that these are loaves of bread that were made that were never touched by a pair of human
Never
hands.
touched.
That from beginning to end, the human body didn't have to be involved in the process. We could eliminate the sort of fear of bacteria and yeast. That these
Wow.
loaves were replicable. Every single loaf looked the same. It was soft, it was white, it was fluffy, and it was sliced. And so this was seen as like the safest, purest kind of bread. And what we've
Mm.
learned over the last 100 years is that that kind of bread is completely devoid of nutrition.
Yes.
Our bodies are not able to digest it. It's devoid of flavor, of texture. That this bread is actually destroying us. That
Oh,
yeast and that bacteria, that long, slow transformation is
right.
necessary for this grain to become something that for this grain to become something that not only are we able to digest, but actually that has the nutrients that we need to survive.
Yeah.
And so, in this attempt to both control and also speed up the process of bread baking, from the growing of the wheat, trying to speed up the growing and harvesting process
Right.
to the actual making of bread,
Mhm.
we have turned bread into something that our bodies cannot handle. But what we're
Yes.
finding is that if you just slow down at one phase of that
Yeah.
process,
Look at my
it makes
shoulders just
a
went.
massive yes. If you slow down either the way that that grain is grown and you have a higher quality, slower grown grain,
Hmm.
that makes bread that is completely different, as you witnessed with your children.
I did with that
Even if you
Montana wheat,
can't,
man.
even if you can't afford the nice flour, if you
Yeah.
slow down the bread baking and you give it this really
Hmm.
long fermentation, for most
Hmm.
people that transforms it enough into a way that they can eat.
Hmm.
And there is research on the slowness of our actual eating, that when we slow down and eat in community, it impacts our ability to digest. And so, God get both invites us and also commands us to rest. That God rested on the seventh day of
Mm.
creation, and both invites and commands us to do the same. And so often I think it's easy for us to really have in mind, like, what does not get done when I take the time to
Hmm.
rest. If I slow down, if I take a break, what is not happening in this time?
Hmm.
And I think we need to flip that paradigm and
Hmm.
and let the bread teach us to ask instead, what does not get done if I don't take the time to rest? If I don't slow down, what is failing to happen in me and the world around me? And
Hmm.
so there is so much that I think we have just misunderstood about
Oh,
both
yeah.
the beauty and the freedom that God offers us in bread.
I am at the front of the line of having to learn that again. Why that lesson just continues. I think maybe all of us are there always, just misunderstanding rest. And here you have brought it all home to that one word. And when our bodies and our hearts are at rest, we are at our best. And so I thank you from the deepest part of me, because you're really, chastise is the wrong word. You are, discipline is harsh. You're just calling me back to a slower pace of life that I have been trying to find for probably maybe even from the utero of my mother, being born into an alcoholic home. My daughter lives in Belgium. She also lived in Uruguay, and both of those cultures, they don't sell sliced bread. It's crazy.
Yeah,
Like Uruguay, particularly, and it's all from a bakery. Like,
yeah,
Europe, and you have a
yeah,
Dutch history. It's all like, I just love going to Belgium to Neve's Cafe and watching them just make loaf after loaf after loaf, and they make enough for the day, and they
mhm,
sell it, and it's gone. So it's
yeah,
very manna-like.
yes,
And I think of this bakery in Uruguay, and the walking there, resistance, walking there, buying my loaf of bread and my muffins and my croissants. And I mean, look, it just brings joy. And it's
it does.
the French baguette in your arm, right? You're calling me back. And I have a feeling you're calling many of us back to slow the heck down. Get your book, Bake and Pray, first and foremost, so that we can get liturgies and recipes to
Yes.
bake bread, and enter into this new year. This may air before Epiphany, not sure, but enter the new year with a bake and pray mindset. A mise en place. Say it again. I love the way you say it.
Mise en place.
Mise en place. And even if you're empty nesters and there's just two of you, like me and my husband, light the candles, set the
Yeah,
plates. Mise en place. Okay. Thank you, Kendall.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it was a true delight.